Hey guys, tonight we drift into a landscape where the sea fog presses low over jagged cliffs, and the wind tastes faintly of salt and pine smoke. You're standing in the damp chill of a Viking fjord, waves nudging against longships moored in a crooked line. Lantern light flickers on the water, the glow revealing shields painted with spiral motifs, some chipped, some shining. In the shadows, you catch the murmur of voices. A barter here, a hushed argument there, because trade is never as quiet as sleep, even when the hour grows late. You feel the unease of a place where trust is rare and survival depends on quick judgments. One hand rests on your coin pouch, the other on the haft of a wooden spear that isn't even yours, because if you linger too long without purpose, someone might decide your belongings would look better on their own belt. You probably won't survive this, at least not in any action hero way. But the good news is, you don't need to. You're here to listen, to wander, and to let your imagination keep you warm while your body slides towards sleep.so. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It always amazes me how these stories travel farther than any Viking longship ever managed. Now, dim the lights, maybe. Turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The settlement stirs with late evening restlessness. You trudge down a muddy track where wood planks creak beneath your boots, a patchwork road half built by the hands of merchants who care less about civic beauty and more about whether their carts stop sinking into muck. Above you, the sky is ink black, yet torches nailed to wooden posts burn with stubborn orange tongues. Each flicker reveals a market built as much on trust as on suspicion, the kind of tension you could butter onto bread if bread were even on sale tonight. The Vikings you watch are not always raiders, though the saga poets never let anyone forget the bloodier adventures. Most days, these men and women are traders, hustlers, survivalists. They lug furs of reindeer and fox, hunks of amber glowing like trapped honey, and iron blades that shine faintly with menace. You hear the clink of scales weighing silver, the universal sigh of someone realizing the weight is just shy of a fair measure. One mainstream historical fact: Vikings relied heavily on silver bullion, whether in coins or in chopped fragments, because barter alone couldn't fuel their expanding trade networks. And yet, not everything follows that neat silver trail. Quirky payments pop up like mushrooms in damp grass. Walrus ivory traded for wine, live falcons swapped for silk. You spot one bearded merchant offering a sack of butter, and honestly, butter as a form of tax and payment sounds more delicious than modern credit card debt. But here's where it gets hazy, like that fog rolling off the fjord. Historians still argue whether Viking loyalty to certain traders was genuine preference or simply the result of limited options. When you're sailing along hostile coasts, your favorite merchant may just be the only one not trying to stab you in the back while selling you barley. You drift further, watching as children chase each other between stalls, their laughter echoing against timbers darkened with tar. A fishmonger shouts, waving a herring as if the future of Norse commerce depends on this one shimmering catch. The crowd groans, a mixture of amusement and annoyance. Your senses pick up the acrid tang of smoked meat, the sour smell of ale sloshed onto dirt, the faint perfume of pine resin burning somewhere nearby that a joke bubbles up in your head. This market feels like the original 7-Eleven, always open, always chaotic, and always selling you something you didn't know you needed, like a half-cured goat hide. Another joke: you notice one Viking tripping over his own shield, and you wonder if slapstick comedy was secretly invented in Scandinavian mud puddles. And a final one: a storyteller nearby tries to attract listeners with wild sagas, but his voice cracks, and suddenly he sounds less like Odin's chosen bard and more like your cousin at karaoke night. The deeper you wander, the more you sense how loyalty, this soft, almost invisible thread, pulls through every exchange. Not loyalty printed on plastic cards, not even loyalty marked in neat accounting books, but loyalty written in repetition. The same fisherman buying his tools from the same smith, the same weaver bringing dyed cloth to the same stall year after year. You notice how one seller slides a little extra into the bundle for a familiar face, a primitive by 9 cloaks, get the 10th free program played out without fanfare. The fjord itself seems to whisper that survival here depends not just on steel or sails, but on who remembers your name when winter comes. And while no parchment ledger records these quiet debts of trust, they linger in the air, stitched into memory as firmly as runes carved into stone, as, oh, you keep walking, boots. Heavy ice soft. The crowd's noise drifts into a dull hum, like the ocean itself humming you toward drowsiness. The flicker of torches blurs into orange smears, the chatter folds into rhythm, and the line between vigilance and sleep grows thinner. Somewhere, in the fog, a raven croaks, and you imagine it's keeping tally of your own loyalty points, one yawn at a time. You follow the path down toward the docks, where the sound of waves slaps against wooden hulls and chains clink in the dark. Here the currency of choice isn't always neat little stamped coins. Instead, you notice glittering shards, jagged pieces of silver hacked apart with blunt axes. They call it hack silver, and it gleams in the torchlight like moonlight shattered on stone. You watch a merchant scoop a handful of these silver fragments into a scale, his brow furrowed, as if each sliver might whisper secrets about his customer. A fair weight equals a fair deal, or so everyone hopes. But the system, while clever, is about as foolproof as balancing coins on a wobbly table. One mainstream historical fact: Viking traders measured value by weight, not by face value. So a clipped coin or hacked fragment was still legitimate currency if it met the right heft. It makes sense when you think about it. Coins minted by distant kings were too rare and too different to rely on. Better to chop up silver into bite-sized chunks you could weigh on the spot. Imagine carrying a candy bar you break apart whenever you're hungry. But instead of sugar, it's precious metal, and instead of snacking, you're bribing someone to sell you salted fish. The quirky side of this system? Sometimes people tested the authenticity of silver by biting it. Softness showed purity, while brittle shards raised suspicion. You picture rows of merchants with slightly crooked teeth, each molar a tiny assay office. A fringe tidbit tells us that some Vikings even carried small touchstones, rubbing their silver against dark rock to check its streak, a kind of pocket chemistry set centuries before anyone thought to bottle bleach. Yet historians still argue whether hack silver was more reliable than coins or simply a messy workaround in regions without consistent minting. Did Vikings trust the weight more than the stamp, or was it just a matter of what was available when they needed to haggle over a barrel of ale? The docks buzz with barter. A tall man with a braided beard trades a broken bracelet for a sack of onions. A woman in a wool cloak haggles over iron nails, tapping her fingers impatiently on the scale. Children scurry around, picking up any silver flakes that fall to the ground, stuffing them into little pouches. You wonder if they're playing or working, maybe both. The air here tastes metallic, or maybe your imagination is filling in the gap, the way a half-dream makes sounds sharper than they really are. You can smell tar bubbling on a ship's hull, pine resin thick in your throat, and beneath it all, the unmistakable stink of fish guts that not even silver can pretty up, somewhere. Behind you, a voice mutters about being shortchanged, and suddenly two men are nose-to-nose, shouting. A joke bubbles up in your head. Viking accounting software probably just consisted of louder yelling and slightly bigger axes. Another joke. Watching them argue over a handful of hacked silver, you realize this is basically the Norse version of someone squinting at their receipt from a modern coffee shop for dollars for oat milk. And one more joke sneaks in. You notice a merchant drop his hacked silver pouch into the sea by accident, and you imagine Poseidon starting his own loyalty program with drowned treasure as entry fees. Still, under the noise, you catch the rhythm of repetition. The same hands meet over the same scales week after week. A bond forms, however fragile, between buyer and seller. One day it's a fair measure, the next maybe a little extra tossed in. These tiny gestures aren't written on paper, but they're remembered, memory serving as ledger, reputation as collateral. The hack silver gleams again in the torchlight, and you realize it isn't just chopped treasure. It's also chopped trust, broken into pieces, but carefully balanced, because that's the only way commerce works in a world where tomorrow's catch depends on today's deal. You let your eyes blur, the glitter turning into soft smudges of light, like stars reflected in water. And while silver clinks and men grumble, Your mind drifts into its own balance, heavy lids weighing down like coins settling on a scale. You wander farther inland, leaving the docks behind, until the scent of brine fades and the air grows thick with smoke from cooking fires. The path opens into a bustling market square, not grand or paved, but a churned patch of earth trampled flat by boots and hooves. Here, silver doesn't always rule the trade. Instead, you find beads, bright glass beads strung in mismatched colors, glimmering like tiny stars trapped on twine. They jingle softly as merchants shuffle them in their palms, weighing beauty. As though it were currency. Amber, too, catches your eye. Polished lumps of honeyed resin glow in the hands of traders, the golden light flickering in torch flame. One mainstream historical fact. Amber from the Baltic coast was a prized Viking export, carried across Europe and the East, sometimes traded as far as the Abbasid Caliphate. To the Vikings, amber wasn't just pretty, it was a bridge between cultures, proof that the sea could connect fjords to deserts. But the quirky side of barter makes you smile. Sometimes merchants accepted wool cloaks as payment. Imagine paying rent with a jacket or tipping your bartender with a sweater. In cold climates, a well-woven cloak was more valuable than a pouch of coins because you could actually survive the winter inside it. You even spot one farmer offering a bright red cloak to a smith in exchange for a sturdy iron axe, the two of them nodding gravely, as though this wool-iron deal were perfectly balanced on the cosmic scales. Still, historians argue whether barter in everyday Viking markets was truly efficient or just a desperate backup when silver ran short. Was wool really as widely used in trade as sagas suggest? Or is that just the storytellers warming up their tales like they warmed their cloaks? The square hums with the sensory overload of commerce. You hear chickens clucking in wicker cages, their wings thudding against the bars. You smell fish roasting on spits, fat dripping into flames with a hiss that sounds suspiciously like applause. You feel the warmth of fur pelts as you brush past a trader hauling them toward a stall, the softness clinging to your fingers even as you let go. You glance at a stall covered in colorful beads, and a mischievous thought pops in. This looks less like serious Viking trade and more like the original Etsy shop. Another joke. A tall man haggles fiercely over the price of onions, as if conquering half of England couldn't feed his stew. And one more. You overhear a boy shouting, 2 goats for 1 cloak, and realize this is basically the Norse version of Black Friday sales, complete chaos, questionable math, and someone always leaving without the deal they wanted. Despite the noise, you notice small patterns. A woman returns to the same bead seller again, slipping a wool mitten into his hands as if it's part of some unspoken agreement. He, in turn, adds an extra bead to her purchase, a gesture that glimmers brighter than the amber itself. These tiny exchanges, invisible to outsiders, are the sparks of loyalty. They aren't written in runes or carved into stone, but they repeat often enough to become predictable. And predictability, well, that's as close to security as anyone can get in a world where storms sink ships and winters freeze fields. As you drift, your mind softens around the imagery. Beads blur into tiny points of light, amber glows like embers fading in a hearth. Cloaks hang heavy on wooden racks like shadows waiting to be worn. The market chatter dips into a drowsy hum, steady as the tide, and you feel yourself swaying along with it. Every step grows slower, as if you too are being bartered, time traded for rest, wakefulness swapped for the promise of sleep. You linger at the edge of the market where the clamor dies down, and instead of silver clinking or beads rattling, you hear the scratch of a knife against wood. A merchant squats on a log, carving neat little marks into a flat stick. Each stroke is deliberate, each notch a memory frozen in timber. You lean closer and realize he's making a tally stick, a primitive ledger where lines carved into wood track debts, promises, and trades. One mainstream historical fact. Tally sticks weren't unique to Vikings. Medieval England used them, too. But in the Viking world they were often paired with runes, those angular letters sharp enough to cut into oak. They could mark how many bushels of barley someone owed, or how many sacks of salt were promised after the next voyage. In a society where paper was rarer than a warm, sunny day in February, would served as accountant, lawyer, and witness. And yet, you spot a quirky twist. Some tally sticks weren't split in half, but kept whole by both parties, an odd display of trust, like two people agreeing to share one toothbrush, but with fewer germs and more potential lawsuits. Occasionally, bones were carved instead of wood, which must have made for rather eerie IOUs. Picture a farmer promising a neighbor a debt carved onto a sheep's leg bone. Talk about putting some real meat behind your credit. Historians still argue whether these tally sticks were widely used or just scattered experiments among merchants who didn't want to rely solely on memory. Some suggest oral contracts and witnesses mattered more than any scratched piece of birch, while others think these humble sticks were the forerunners of written bookkeeping in Scandinavia. You watch as the merchant blows the wood dust away, then tucks the tally stick into his belt. The buyer nods, satisfied, as if those scratches truly bind the deal. Around them, the night seems to lean in, the fog dampening every sound except the faint rasp of blade on wood. The sensory detail wraps around you. The faint smell of sap rising from fresh cuts, the smoothness of the polished surface as you imagine. Running your fingers along the grooves, the muffled chatter of the market fading into the background like the tide going out, and humor still sneaks in. One joke springs up. Watching the merchant fumble with his tally stick, you realize this is basically the Viking version of Excel spreadsheets. Except no one's yelling about formulas, just about notches being crooked. Another joke, you notice. A trader carving tally marks by lamplight and wonder if he's secretly just doodling to avoid looking busy. And one last joke. Somewhere a kid picks up an abandoned tally stick and uses it as a sword, which is probably how half the records got mysteriously lost. But under the gentle absurdity lies the pulse of loyalty again. If you hold onto the same tally stick with the same merchant season after season, you're not just tracking numbers, you're tracking trust. You're building a rhythm of return, a pattern that whispers, "I'll be back, and you'll be ready." As the night grows cooler, your breath curls into mist. The lines on the tally stick seem to blur, like runes drifting into dream shapes. The rhythm of scratching, the steady motion of blade against wood, becomes a lullaby, odd, rough, but soothing all the same. And as the merchant pockets his carved memory, you tuck your own into the soft recess of drowsiness, ready to let the world of wood and rune fade into shadow. You leave the tally stick merchant behind and climb a slope toward a wooden hall perched above the settlement. Smoke coils from its thatched roof, glowing red at the edges where embers escape into the night. Inside, you see warriors lounging, with horns of ale, but your attention drifts past them to the figure seated at the high seat, a local chieftain, or maybe a king if you're generous with titles. He doesn't look much like the crown-wearing monarchs of storybooks. His wealth isn't stacked in gold, but in butter, hides, and sacks of grain piled against the wall. One mainstream historical fact. In Viking Age Scandinavia, rulers often collected taxes and tribute in kind rather than in coin. Butter was especially prized in Norway, where smooth bricks of it could be stored, traded, and even exported. Animal hides, too, were essential, not just for clothing, but for ship sails, tents, and endless repairs. A king rich in butter and hides wasn't glamorous, but he was undeniably powerful, able to feed his men and clothe them through bitter winters. The quirky side of this arrangement makes you smirk. Some communities supposedly had to pay taxes in live hawks or dogs bred for hunting. Imagine showing up on tax day with a squirming falcon under your arm and a hope that it doesn't decide to peck your nose off before you get credit for it. It feels less like bureaucracy and more like the world's oddest farmer's market. Historians still argue whether these tributes were consistent or improvised. Were butter and hides formalized taxes across the kingdom, or were they simply the most convenient commodities in places where coins were scarce? The sagas tell one version, archaeology hints at another, and somewhere in between lies the truth, hazy as smoke rising from this very hall. You edge closer, noticing the sensory details. The butter bricks glisten faintly in torchlight, their surfaces softening just enough to release a nutty scent. The hides hang heavy, still carrying the faint musk of the animals they once wrapped. Your boots sink slightly into rushes strewn on the floor, their herbal smell mixing with mead, sweat, and smoke. The king raises his drinking horn, and for a moment you wonder if loyalty here is less about affection and more about obligation. Pay your butter, surrender your hides, and you secure the protection of the man in the high seat. Fail to pay, and winter may find you alone, cloaked only in frost that a joke slips into your mind. This tax system sounds suspiciously like the first. Subscription plan, pay monthly in butter, get free raids included. Another joke, watching a scribe try to tally up hides, you imagine him running out of fingers, then toes, then just giving up with a shrug. And a final joke, one unlucky farmer brings rancid butter, and suddenly you realize that ancient tax fraud was probably more smelly than sneaky. But beneath the humor, you catch the thread of loyalty again. Those who pay faithfully year after year gain more than safety. They gain recognition, a place in the memory of the hall, a nod from the king that says, I know you, I know your farm, I'll remember when you need me. That recognition is worth more than silver, because in the Viking world, a name carried farther than coin across fjord and forest. The hall fades as you blink slowly. The butter piles blur into golden smudges, the hides into dark, heavy curtains. The firelight softens, shadows stretch, and the king's voice drops into a low rumble, almost like distant thunder. It vibrates in your chest, soothing and steady, pulling you closer to sleep even as the world of taxes and tribute drifts away into silence. You drift back down the slope toward the settlement's heart, where the hall noise fades and a softer murmur takes over. At the edge of the market, a circle of sailors gathers around a crackling fire. Their cloaks are damp, boots muddy, and voices rough from salt air. Yet their eyes glitter as they lean close, trading stories the way they trade. Goods, loud, overlapping, half-believed. Point one mainstream historical fact. Viking marketplaces weren't just places to buy and sell. They were social hubs where merchants, warriors, and farmers exchanged news, gossip, and tales from across the seas. Storytelling itself was a form of currency, binding communities together when parchment and official records were scarce. You can almost hear the sagas growing in real time, each exaggeration swelling like waves in a storm. But here's the quirky bit. Sometimes gossip became part of contracts. A whispered tale about one merchant's honesty or dishonesty could shape the value of a deal before any silver changed hands. You notice one sailor telling how Olaf the first seller once cheated a Dane, and suddenly half the group mutters about avoiding Olaf's stall. Reputation travels faster than any ship, and in a world without Yelp reviews, Firelight gossip was the 5-star rating system. Historians still argue whether these informal reviews carried as much weight as actual agreements. Was reputation really enough to keep traders honest, or did people simply endure dishonesty when they had no alternatives? Either way, you sense that trust in this world was less about ink on parchment and more about how stories stuck in people's minds. The firelight makes their faces flicker, shadows darting across rough beards and scarred cheeks. You catch the scent of wood smoke blending with roasted fish, the taste of salt still clinging to their words. Every time someone laughs, it bursts sharp and loud, startling the ravens perched above. And every time the talk dips into suspicion, the air cools, as if even the flames hesitate. You chuckle softly at the humor tucked in these scenes. First joke. One sailor insists he saw a whale bigger than the whole fjord, and you realize fishermen have always been professional exaggerators. Second joke. Another man swears his axe once glowed in the dark, and you think, congratulations, buddy, you've invented Viking glow sticks. Third joke. A listener nods sagely through every tale, then admits he's deaf in one ear, loyal. Audience, minimal fact-checking. Yet, through the noise, the thread of loyalty shows itself again. The same voices return to the same fires each season, trusting the same storytellers, repeating the same names until memory turns them into truth. You notice a younger sailor hanging on every word, eyes wide, as if choosing whom to trust tomorrow with his silver or his ship. Stories aren't just entertainment here. They're contracts in smoke, signed in laughter and sealed in reputation. As the voices fade into a rhythmic hum, you feel the fire's warmth soak into your bones. The crackle of burning wood becomes steady, like the ticking of a giant clock. The sailor's gossip blends into white noise, less about words and more about the cadence of speech. Your eyelids grow heavier. Shadows flicker and stretch until they look like sails unfurling in the wind. And before you know it, You're drifting with them, carried by stories into a sea of drowsy quiet. The fire fades behind you, and you follow the flow of travelers who push carts laden with bundles wrapped in cloth. Among them walk pilgrims. Yes, pilgrims of a sort, though they don't look like the cloaked figures of later centuries trudging toward holy shrines. These are merchants, warriors, and wanderers who carry with them tiny relic trinkets, talismans meant to reassure them as much as to signal belonging along their routes. Point 1 Mainstream historical fact. Viking routes stretched wide, from the fjords of Norway to Constantinople and even the edge of the Caspian Sea. Along these routes, tokens and small objects passed from hand to hand, serving as mementos of journeys or proofs of safe passage. A carved wooden amulet from one settlement might be instantly recognized in another, easing introductions and building trust. The quirky side is stranger still. Some of these trinkets were fashioned from animal teeth or bits of bone, carved into charms that looked half like jewelry and half like warnings. Imagine showing your travel card in the form of a fox tooth strung on sinew. Practical, intimidating, and definitely harder to counterfeit than a laminated badge. Archaeologists have even found miniature Thor's hammer pendants that may have served not only as religious symbols, but also as quiet membership tokens, subtle hints that you were in the club. But historians still argue whether these tokens truly acted like passports or if they were simply good luck charms. Were they practical documents of loyalty and belonging, or just personal ornaments that storytellers later romanticized into functional items? The debate lingers like smoke, swirling but never settling. You walk among them, listening to the creak of leather belts and the soft clink of amulets brushing together. The air smells of sweat and pine resin, heavy with the tang of travel. Each trinket catches the firelight differently. Beads sparkle, hammered copper glows warm, bone glimmers pale and ghostly. One man clutches a polished amber pendant, rubbing it with his thumb as if to summon protection. The humor here is quiet but undeniable. First joke. You watch a pilgrim drop his lucky amulet in the mud, then refuse to pick it up because luck is only good when it's clean. A superstition that sounds oddly familiar to people who won't use a lucky penny unless it's heads up. Second joke. Another traveler compares the size of his Thor's hammer pendant with his neighbor's, bragging like kids showing off action figures. Third joke. One woman insists her carved bone charm can ward off hangovers, and judging by her flushed face, you suspect she's still waiting for it to kick in. Still, beneath the laughter and the trinkets lies the quiet rhythm of loyalty. These objects, whether sacred or silly, anchor people to their networks. A charm reminds you of a merchant you trust. A pendant signals you belong to a faith shared across oceans. A bead ties you to home, even when you're 1,000 miles away. Each small token is a thread in a web that stretches wider than any one fjord, binding strangers into a kind of improvised fellowship. As you watch the travelers shuffle forward, your vision softens. The tokens blur into glowing dots, like stars, scattered across a velvet sky. The steady shuffle of feet becomes a lullaby rhythm, slow and inevitable. You breathe with it, your chest rising and falling like the tide, and the thought of tokens and trinkets slips gently into dream territory, where every charm is just a promise that you're safe to drift deeper into rest. The road bends away from the bustle of traders, and you spot a lonely farmhouse standing against the twilight. Smoke curls lazily from its chimney, and in the doorway, a farmer scratches at a scrap of bone with the tip of a knife. You step closer, curious, and realize he's etching a promise into it. An IOU, if you will, though nothing like the glossy slips you'd find tucked into a modern wallet. Point 1 Mainstream historical fact. In regions where paper was absent and silver was scarce, contracts were often written on whatever durable material lay at hand. Sometimes wood, sometimes antler, and, yes, sometimes bone. These makeshift records help people remember who owed grain, wool, or labor after the harvest. In a largely oral culture, physical tokens gave debts a little more gravity than words drifting on the wind. The quirky side here is hard to miss. Imagine offering your neighbor half a sheep and writing the receipt on the sheep's leftover shin bone. Archaeologists have found inscribed bones across northern Europe, leading some to suggest they weren't just tools or charms, but actual tallies. A bone IOU isn't something you lose between the couch cushions. It sits heavy in your hand, a literal reminder that your debt has teeth. But historians still argue whether these inscriptions really functioned as binding agreements or whether they were just practice runs for carving, symbols of goodwill rather than enforceable contracts. Some even think these bone notes were more ceremonial than practical, used to honor promises among kin rather than strangers. The truth is as slippery as a wet field in spring. The farmer sighs, running his thumb over the carved grooves. You smell the faint tang of marrow still clinging to the bone, sharp in the cool night air. The cottage yard carries other scents too. Damp hay, the sweetness of fermenting apples, the musk of sheep huddled in a pen nearby. The bone, pale and rough-edged, gleams in the torchlight like an artifact halfway between tool and talisman. And of course, the humor creeps in. First joke. Watching this farmer etch an IOU into bone, you realize it's the Viking version of sticky notes, just much harder to crumple up and toss away. Second joke. A neighbor walks by, sees the bone carving, and mutters, "That's one. Way to keep your promises until the dog chews it." Third joke. The farmer's wife scolds him for wasting time, saying, "Just remember it in your head." And you can almost hear the timeless argument between "write it down" and "I'll remember." Still, beneath the chuckles, you feel loyalty humming here too. Writing a promise in bone isn't just practical, it's symbolic. It tells the other person, this matters enough to mark in something lasting. When debts stretch across seasons, trust deepens with every carved groove, every repeated favor, every return to the same neighbor for help. This, too, is a kind of loyalty card, punched not with holes, but with cuts on bone. Your eyes blur as you picture the grooves glowing faintly, as if the bone itself is breathing. The farmhouse grows hazy, the sheep's bleating softens into a gentle chorus, and the night air folds around you like a wool blanket. Each notch in the bone looks less like a record and more like a lullaby rhythm, coaxing you downward, deeper into that drowsy space where promises float like whispers, remembered, even in dreams. You leave the farmer's cottage and follow a narrow track until it widens near a bend in the river. There, wooden posts rise from the mud, and a cluster of tents and huts clings to the shore like barnacles. The air hums with activity. This is a trading post, rough but alive, where merchants wait like fishermen casting nets for loyal customers to swim back their way. Point one mainstream historical fact. Viking trade wasn't confined to permanent towns. Seasonal trading posts, often set up along rivers or coasts, became hubs where merchants from far-flung regions met. Some of these sites, like Hedeby or Kapang, grew into proto-urban centers, buzzing with long-distance goods and new faces. Others remained temporary camps, dissolving once the season's business was done. The quirky twist? Competition could be fierce. To attract repeat business, traders sometimes staged small performances, storytelling, music, or even juggling, to stand out. Picture a fur seller balancing an axe on his chin just to convince you to buy another pelt. There are tales of merchants giving away samples too. Imagine tasting a sliver of smoked fish before committing to a whole barrel. Loyalty perks before loyalty cards. Historians still argue whether such perks really existed or whether later sagas simply embroidered reality with flair. Were merchants genuinely scheming to win customers back, or did survival in a brutal economy leave little room for marketing tricks? The line between practical barter and theatrical hustle is blurred, like ripples across this very river. You soak in the sensory details, the rush of water tugging at the posts, the creak of rope binding ships to shore, the chatter of many tongues, Norse, Frisian, Slavic, maybe even Arabic. The air tastes of wood smoke mingled with drying fish. Your boots sink into damp sand as you step past piles of trade goods, sacks of grain, coils of rope, gleaming piles of furs, and the humor bubbles up naturally. First joke. You overhear one trader shout, "Best prices in the north," and realize Viking marketing slogans weren't much more original than modern billboards. Second joke. A boy tries juggling apples to lure buyers, but drops every single one. Still counts as a fruit sale, you suppose. Third joke. Two merchants argue about who invented discounts. proving once again that capitalism's pettiest battles are timeless. Yet through the chaos, you notice the rhythm of return. A fisherman greets the same rope seller he bought from last season, slapping him on the shoulder as if no time has passed. A woman who sells amber beads hands a familiar child a tiny trinket for free, her smile carrying the weight of years of repeated exchanges. Loyalty isn't just about prices. It's about predictability, about the relief of finding the same face waiting at the same bend in the same river. As you stand on the bank, your gaze softens. The torches blur into golden smudges across the water, their reflections trembling. Like sleepy eyes. The hum of the crowd fades into a steady drone, a lullaby made of trade talk and splashing oars. The whole post feels like a dream itself, temporary, fragile, yet returning each season like a heartbeat. And in that rhythm, you sway, drifting toward sleep as loyalties fold you into their gentle current. You follow the riverbank a little farther, and the sounds of trade thin out until a different rhythm reaches your ears. Laughter, clinking mugs, the low rumble of song. You come upon an alehouse, little more than rough timber walls and a smoky thatched roof, yet glowing with warmth against the night. Inside, the atmosphere is thick with spilled drink, roasted meat, and the chatter of men and women unwinding. After long days of barter. One mainstream historical fact. Viking communities had tavern-like gathering places where mead and ale flowed freely, often doubling as informal meeting halls. Business, gossip, and entertainment all mingled here, as much a part of economic life as the market itself. You glance at a long table where drinkers raise horn mugs, each vessel etched with notches. They're not just decoration. These are drinking tabs, carved marks tracking how many rounds someone owes. The alehouse keeper runs a calloused finger along the grooves like a musician plucking strings. When the night ends, debts aren't paid with coins, but with trust that the notch keeper will return tomorrow or the next week to settle. The quirky side of this practice is almost too good. Imagine keeping your bar tab literally carved into your mug, carrying the evidence home with you. And worse, what if your drinking buddy accidentally borrowed your horn? Suddenly your debts are on his table. Archaeologists even suggest that some horns were split between two owners, one half of a tally to ensure fairness. Nothing says friendship like arguing over who owes who the goat cheese platter. Historians still argue whether these drinking notches were a common accounting method or just isolated traditions. Were taverns really keeping systematic ledgers, or do we just love the image of Vikings being rowdy but oddly responsible at the same time? The sensory world of the alehouse soaks into you. The air is thick with roasted pork, smoke curling lazily from torches wedged between beams. Mead spills sticky across the floorboards, mixing with the sour tang of sweat. Laughter bursts and fades, as comforting as waves crashing on the shore outside. Your ears ring with songs, half chants, half shouts, rhythmic and hypnotic, designed less to impress and more to keep everyone awake until the mugs are empty, and humor dances through the room. First joke. One drunk carves too many notches on his mug just to brag, and you realize this is the medieval equivalent of inflating your credit score. Second joke. Another guest insists his horn refills itself when no one's looking, a convenient miracle only he seems to witness. Third joke. The tavern keeper sighs when a customer tries to pay in onions, muttering, "Fine, but I'm not peeling them." Yet under the jokes lies the quiet truth of loyalty. Tabs weren't just about keeping score. They were about returning, about the promise that you'd come back to the same bench, the same horn, the same barkeep. Each notch on a mug was less a debt and more a guarantee of repeat business. The alehouse became a place where loyalty was carved as tangibly as runes in oak. Your vision softens as the firelight blurs, horns glowing like halos, laughter stretching into a distant hum. The sound of carving a notch turns rhythmic, steady, almost like the ticking of a metronome coaxing your heartbeat slower. You feel your body sway with the chant, your breath fall in time with the clinking mugs. And just as the Vikings let their debts carry them into tomorrow, you let the notches carry you gently into the drift of sleep. The alehouse glow fades behind you, replaced by the chill dampness of night air along the path. You walk until the din of drunken songs becomes a faint echo, and ahead you find another camp of traders. This time the stalls are stacked with furs, Fox, marten, beaver, even polar bear, their pelts gleaming in firelight. The merchants, heavy-cloaked and watchful, lean over their wares with a pride that borders on ceremony. Point one mainstream historical fact. The fur trade was a cornerstone of Viking commerce. Scandinavian furs were shipped south and east in enormous quantities, prized across Europe and the Middle East. Warm, durable, and a visible status symbol, they were as valuable as coin. The quirky side lies in how these fur traders courted loyalty. Archaeological hints and saga references suggest sellers sometimes rewarded repeat customers with hidden bargains. A familiar face might get an extra pelt tucked into the bundle, or a slightly better grade of fur slipped in without charge. Imagine buying 10 fox skins and finding an 11th thrown in. A primitive buy 10, get one free scheme, but softer and warmer than any punch card. Historians still argue whether this kind of favoritism was systematic or anecdotal. Were traders deliberately fostering loyalty, or did generosity simply flow from kinship ties and personal friendship? Maybe both, because in a world of harsh winters, choosing whom to keep warm could be as much strategy as kindness. You step closer, and the sensory details wrap around you. The air smells of tanned leather and smoke, heavy with the musk of animal pelts. Your fingers brush a wolfskin and it feels thick, almost alive with lingering wildness. You hear the rustle of furs, shifting as merchants arrange their piles, the sound like whispers in the dark. A buyer haggles over a stack of beaver pelts, his voice low and tense, but his eyes soften when the seller quietly adds one more to the bundle with a wink, and humor finds its way in. First joke. One trader holds up a bear pelt so large it nearly swallows him whole, making him look like a child playing dress-up. Second joke. Another swears his furs are wolf-free, which makes no sense since wolf pelts are exactly what he's selling. Third joke. A fox skin slips off the stall onto the ground, and someone mutters, "Even dead foxes are cunning." But beneath the laughter, you see how loyalty blooms here. A buyer who gets a little extra today is more likely to come back tomorrow, or even sail across seas to return next year. In a culture without advertising banners or jingles, loyalty was grown in gestures. A free pelt, a remembered name, a friendly price whispered low so no one else overhears. As you stand in the flickering light, your gaze softens. The fur piles blur into shadowy hills, the firelight shimmering like a golden haze. The murmurs of trade flatten into a hum, steady and slow, almost like the sound of breathing under thick blankets. You feel warmth in the thought of repeat bargains, comfort in the pattern of trust, and soon the marketplace itself becomes a quilt, wrapping you gently in drowsy fur. Past the fur stalls, the night thickens with wood smoke and the murmur of low voices. You follow the sound into a long, smoky hall lit by torches wedged into blackened beams. The space smells of charred oak, wet wool, and the faint sweetness of mead poured into shallow bowls. Here, artisans sit hunched over benches, smiths, carvers, and weavers, while others lean close, trading whispers like currency. This isn't the rowdy tavern or the noisy market. It's quieter, conspiratorial, and yet still threaded with the pulse of commerce. Point one mainstream historical fact. In many Norse communities, artisans began forming proto-guilds, loose networks where craftsmen shared rituals, protected each other's trades, and ensured skills passed through trusted hands. While not as formal as later medieval guilds, these gatherings created small circles of professional loyalty. A blacksmith might share techniques with an apprentice he trusted, but keep secrets from strangers outside the circle. The quirky side here lies in the rituals. To strengthen bonds, craftsmen sometimes exchanged symbolic gifts, a carved bead, a special tool, or even just a scrap of cloth with a distinct weave. These weren't flashy payments. They were gestures, tokens of loyalty signaling, "You're one of us." Imagine a smith slipping his apprentice a bent nail as a reminder of where he began. To outsiders, it looks like junk, but to the group, it's a badge of belonging. Historians still argue whether these gift rituals were truly organized systems or simply personal quirks later exaggerated by saga writers. Did guild-like groups really exist in the Viking Age, or are we retrofitting medieval models onto a looser, more fluid society? The evidence is faint, like smoke in a drafty hall, visible, but hard to hold. the sensory weight of the room presses on you. Sparks fly as a hammer strikes iron, showering orange light across soot-dark faces, while fibers hang in the air, catching torch glow like dust motes in a sunbeam. A weaver hums under her breath, her hands moving rhythmically across a loom. The sound blends with the crackle of fire, forming a hypnotic pulse that settles into your chest. And humor makes its sly entrance here too. First joke. One craftsman coughs dramatically from the smoke and declares, "We're inventing smoked wool now," earning groans from the others. Second joke. A carver presents his friend with a lopsided wooden spoon, insisting it's a masterpiece, half gift, half prank. Third joke. A young apprentice sneaks extra mead and hiccups loudly, claiming it's part of the ritual. But beneath the laughter, loyalty hums steady. These artisans aren't just making tools and trinkets. They're making bonds. A shared joke, a secret passed on, a gift exchanged. All of it builds a foundation where customers know exactly which smith will sharpen their blade, which weaver will dye their cloth, which carver will shape their runes. Loyalty here doesn't come from flashy discounts or grand gestures. It comes from quiet repetition, trust slowly hammered into shape like iron on an anvil. As the night stretches on, your vision softens. The torchlight blurs into golden haze. The rhythmic clang of hammering slows until it sounds like a heartbeat. You feel yourself lean with it, drawn into the gentle sway of repetition. The hall breathes smoke and warmth, and you breathe along with it, drifting into that steady rhythm where loyalty and sleep feel strangely the same. You leave the smoky artisan hall and wander toward the shoreline again, where longships rest like slumbering beasts. Their prows curl upward, carved into dragons and serpents that glint faintly in the moonlight. But as you walk along the line of ships, you notice another detail: painted shields and carved markings. Each ship branded with the symbols of its clan. One mainstream historical fact. Viking ships often carried distinct decorations, shield colors, carved figureheads, even sail patterns that signaled their owners. These weren't just aesthetic choices, they were identifiers in battle, on trade routes, and in foreign harbors. For returning customers, these symbols functioned like logos, guiding them back to familiar merchants or crews they trusted. The quirky twist is how these markings sometimes stretched beyond ships. Merchants occasionally branded their wares with clan symbols, burned into wooden crates or stitched onto sacks, like a medieval version of labeling. Imagine recognizing your favorite fur seller's goods just by the little spiral wolf etched into a barrel. It's branding, Viking style, long before neon signs and catchy jingles. Historians still argue whether these clan symbols were consciously used for marketing or were simply extensions of family pride. Did traders deliberately craft recognizable brands? Or did the overlap of kinship and commerce just happen to mimic the effect? The answer drifts somewhere between intention and accident, as murky as the river's reflection at night. You step closer to a ship, fingers tracing the rough paint of a shield nailed along its side. The wood smells of tar, sea salt, and faint fish oil rubbed in for waterproofing. A sail hangs slack, dyed deep red, creased from countless journeys. The air hums with silence, broken only by waves lapping at hulls and the distant creak of mooring. Ropes straining against posts, and of course, humor sneaks into the scene. First joke. You realize these painted shields are basically medieval billboards, loud, bold, and probably just as prone to exaggeration. Second joke. A sailor touches up his clan's symbol with fresh paint, smearing it accidentally across his beard, now branded as property of his own ship. Third joke. A passing child proudly insists his family's ship dragon spits real fire, and you can't help but grin at the world's first false advertising. But beneath the jokes, loyalty weaves its quiet thread again. A buyer spotting that familiar wolf emblem on a sack of grain knows he's dealing with someone who has delivered fair measure before. A returning sailor finds his way to the same captain's ship, recognizing the carved dragon that once carried him safely through storms. These symbols become promises, silent contracts of quality and trust. Your gaze softens as the ships blur together in the dim light, their prows swaying gently like heads nodding in unison. The painted shields smear into muted patches of color. The rope creaks into a slow, rocking rhythm. It feels less like a harbor and more like a cradle, rocking you into deeper drowsiness. You breathe in the scent of tar and sea air, and for a moment, loyalty itself smells like salt and pine, as calming as a lullaby on the waves. The ships fade into the mist behind you, and soon you find yourself in a market square again. This time, it's quieter, not the rowdy chatter of barter, but a space charged with solemn attention. Two men stand facing each other, palms pressed together in a clasp that lasts longer than a handshake. Around them, others nod as if a contract has just been signed. In Air.1 mainstream historical fact, Viking societies valued oaths and rituals as binding agreements. Deals were often cemented with clasped hands, sworn words, or even ritual gestures involving weapons or sacred objects. In a culture where parchment was scarce and lawyers non-existent, an oath before witnesses was as strong as iron. The quirky side comes through in the details. Sometimes an oath was sealed by spitting into the palm before shaking hands, hardly sanitary, but memorable. Other times, both parties might place a hand on a sword hilt while swearing, as if the blade itself enforced honesty. Imagine modern contracts requiring you to balance a sharp axe while signing. Effective, perhaps, but definitely not OSHA-approved. Historians still argue whether these rituals were universal practices or localized traditions. Were handshakes and oaths binding across all of Scandinavia, or did certain communities emphasize them while others leaned more on tally sticks or silver? The sagas give plenty of examples, but sagas, like gossip, have a way of dressing up reality. You stand in the circle of onlookers, the sensory weight pulling at you. Torches hiss as resin drips into flames. The night air tastes faintly metallic, as if echoing the iron of the swords at everyone's hips. You can hear the clasp of palms, rough, calloused, echoing like leather slapping wood. Faces in the crowd glow faintly orange, eyes intent, breaths held as if witnessing more than words, something sacred in the act itself, and humor nestles in even here. First joke. One man spits into his hand for an oath, but his opponent recoils and mutters, "We'll call that clause void." Second joke. A nervous farmer forgets his lines mid-oath and blurts out a prayer to the wrong god, leaving everyone laughing. Third joke. Someone in the crowd complains, "Back in my day, oaths were shorter," proving that impatience is eternal. Still, beneath the chuckles, loyalty pulses strong. These rituals weren't just about sealing one deal. They were about weaving a network of trust that lasted beyond the moment. A good oath remembered became a reason to return. A handshake witnessed became a precedent for future trades. Every clasp of hands was another stitch in the fabric of loyalty, holding community together tighter than rope holds a sail. Your eyes blur as you watch. The clasped hands glow brighter in the firelight, then smear into a single soft blur. No longer two men, but one silhouette of trust. The murmurs of the crowd fade into a steady hush, like a wind slipping through reeds. The torches sway, their flames stretching longer, slower, like breath itself. And just as the oaths bind merchants to each other, the rhythm of the scene binds you into calm, carrying you closer toward sleep. The marketplace thins, and your steps carry you toward a smaller cluster of stalls tucked near the edge of the square. Here, the goods on display are not sacks of grain or bundles of hides, but delicate things: brightly dyed cloth, strands of beads, tiny pouches of exotic spices. The air feels different, almost perfumed, as though you've stepped into another world layered on top of the rough Viking settlement. Point one mainstream historical fact. Through trade routes reaching into Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate, Vikings acquired luxury imports, silk, spices, fine glassware, that filtered back into Scandinavia. These items weren't everyday necessities. They were status symbols, coveted by the wealthy and used to show prestige. The quirky side lies in how these rarities reinforced loyalty. Traders often reserved such items for repeat buyers, particularly chieftains and well-connected families. A returning customer might be rewarded with first choice of the new silks or a private sample of imported cinnamon. Imagine a members-only shelf in a smoky Viking tent, because who wouldn't want to flash the latest Constantinople silk at the next feast? Historians still argue whether this distribution was calculated strategy or simple favoritism. Were merchants consciously using luxury items as loyalty rewards, or were they just currying favor with the powerful to secure protection? The truth, as usual, probably blends both, strategy wrapped in necessity, gilded with opportunity. You let the sensory details wash over you. The silk shimmers even in low torchlight, smooth as water running through your fingers. Spices release their aromas. Into the night air, sharp pepper, earthy cumin, faint sweetness of cinnamon. The beads glitter like captured dew, while the glass cups gleam fragile and alien against the rough wood of the stall, and humor sparkles in this exotic corner. First joke. One merchant brags that his silk is so fine it can pass through a ring, only to have it snag on a splinter, sales pitch ruined. Second joke. A warrior sniffs pepper, sneezes so violently he nearly topples into the spice sacks, proving loyalty programs should come with tissues. Third joke. A child eyes the glass cups, pokes one, and whispers, "Too shiny to drink out of," as though Vikings suddenly discovered the concept of display only. But beneath the laughter, loyalty glows here brighter than the silk. A customer who gets early access to rare imports feels special, tied to the merchant by invisible threads of privilege. These perks aren't carved into tally sticks or recorded in silver. They're remembered in status. He trusted me with silk before anyone else. That kind of loyalty doesn't just bring customers back. It cements reputations across clans and seas. The images soften as your gaze lingers. Silks blur into flowing rivers of color, beads scatter into little stars, spices swirl into aromatic clouds. The murmur of haggling lowers into a hum like a lullaby, steady and slow. You breathe deeply, as though inhaling the cinnamon itself. And the warmth carries you down, drowsy and content, wrapped in the gentle luxury of imagined sleep. The shimmer of silks fades behind you, and soon you're walking along a palisade where guards lean on spears, their cloaks pulled tight against. The chill. The market may be about trade, but you begin to notice another currency exchanged here: protection. As dusk thickens into night, men with scarred faces and steady eyes linger at the edge of stalls, not buying, not selling, but watching. Point one. Mainstream historical fact. Viking communities often relied on local chieftains or merchant associations to guarantee safety in markets and trade routes. A returning customer wasn't just buying goods. He was buying into a system where repeated loyalty meant greater assurance of protection. A trader who supported a powerful leader could expect his goods to be guarded, his disputes resolved, his journey made safer. The quirky side of this arrangement almost feels familiar. Think of it as the first premium membership. Loyal patrons might receive escorts on dangerous roads, or access to safe harbors controlled by friendly clans. Protection was bundled into the bargain, a hidden perk of choosing the same sellers season after season. And just like today, where buying the upgraded package might get you free shipping, here it might keep your ship from being plundered. But historians still argue whether this protection was formalized, an early version of market law, or simply a matter of personal relationships and favors. Was loyalty enforced by rules, or by the muscle of a chieftain's men leaning on spears at the gate? The evidence is blurred, caught between sagas and fragments of law codes. The sensory details close in around you. The firelight gleams off polished spearheads. The damp earth under your boots smells faintly of iron, trampled with ash and pine needles. The murmurs of merchants lower as guards pass by, like ripples in a pond when a stone drops. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, then falls silent, and humor, even here, refuses to stay away. First joke. One guard dozes on his post, his spear tilting dangerously like a drooping sunflower. Second joke. Another insists he's intimidating, but a child pokes his helmet with a stick, giggling. Third joke. A merchant sighs loudly, saying, "Loyalty is nice, but can loyalty also stop goats from stealing my cabbages?" Yet beneath the laughter, loyalty glimmers again. Customers who returned to the same traders weren't only trusting the quality of the goods. They were trusting the invisible shield wrapped around them, the assurance that their loyalty bought them more than wool or fish. It bought them safety, the peace of knowing that tomorrow they could trade again, live again, return again. Your vision softens as the torches sway like tall candles in the mist. The guards blur into shadows with gleaming points, no longer men, but outlines rocking gently in the night. The murmurs fade into a low hum, steady as the breath of someone asleep beside you. You feel yourself leaning into that same protection, letting loyalty guard you as surely as spears guard the market, drifting closer to the quiet security of dreams. Past the guarded palisade, the ground opens into a stony clearing where a tall slab rises against the night sky. Its surface is etched with runes, deep grooves catching torchlight in shifting patterns. You draw closer, tracing the lines with your eyes, and realize this is more than a memorial stone. It's advertising. The carved words commemorate a merchant's name, his travels, his generosity. A stone billboard planted for all to see. Point one mainstream historical fact. Runestones were often erected in Viking Age Scandinavia, commemorating deeds, wealth, or family. While many honored the dead, some celebrated living merchants and travelers, boasting of journeys to distant lands and generous gifts to kin. In essence, they advertised a reputation. Do business with me. I've proven my worth. The quirky side lies in the flamboyance of these stones. Imagine chiseling your resume into granite, complete with humble brag lines like, "He gave much silver," or "He sailed to Miklagard and returned with honor." Some even included stylized imagery of ships or trade goods, turning the rock into a graphic design portfolio that would last centuries longer than parchment. Historians still argue whether these inscriptions truly functioned as commerce-driven advertising or were primarily about status and remembrance. Were they practical tools to attract trade or vanity projects designed to impress neighbors and gods alike? Perhaps both. The stones served the dead, but the living still had to squint at it and decide whether this was someone they wanted to trust. You take in the sensory world of the stone. The air is cool here, filled with the mineral tang of freshly chipped rock. Your fingers brush the grooves, rough and deep, still sharp despite centuries of weather. Torches flicker, their light racing across the carved dragon coils etched into the border. Around you, silence gathers, broken only by the distant river and the occasional creak of shifting timber in the wind. And humor, even here, pokes through the solemnity. First joke. Reading a boast about silver donations, you mutter, "Congratulations, you invented the world's first influencer shoutout." Second joke. One rune carver left his name awkwardly small at the bottom, like an artist sneaking a signature no one asked for. Third joke. A passerby squints at the stone, sighs, and says, "I can't read runes anyway. Looks like fancy scratches." Still, beneath the wit lies loyalty's echo. A merchant's name carved in stone ensured customers remembered him long after voices faded. It wasn't just about bragging. It was about cultivating trust, saying, "This man was generous. This man traveled far. This man can be relied on." Every stone was a frozen endorsement, a loyalty program you could stumble across while walking your sheep. Your vision drifts as the runes blur into glowing lines, curling and twisting like rivers of light across the rock. The stone no longer looms but sways gently, as if rocking in rhythm with your breath. Each groove hums like a faint lullaby, steady, eternal, whispering of names and reputations carved into memory. And as the night deepens, you let the stone's calm permanence carry you further towards sleep. You leave the runestone glowing faintly in the night and follow the sound of music drifting through the trees. Soon, you stumble into a wide meadow, alive with torches and voices. It's a seasonal fair, the kind that blooms once a year and then vanishes like a dream. Tensed, the field in crooked lines, fires burn in shallow pits, and the air is thick with roasted meat, smoke, and the laughter of people who've waited all year to see familiar faces. Point one mainstream historical fact. Viking societies held regular seasonal markets and fairs, often linked to religious festivals or harvest times. These gatherings drew traders from far and wide, allowing people to renew alliances, swap goods, and reinforce social bonds. The quirky side? These fairs weren't only about trade. They mixed business with games, feasting, even wrestling contests. You watch as two burly men grapple in the dirt while children giggle over bead necklaces. Somewhere a skald recites a saga, his voice rising and falling like waves, and nearby, a smith hammers tokens into shape just for the occasion. Imagine a county fair, but with more axes and fewer Ferris wheels. Historians still argue whether loyalty at these fairs was based on true attachment to certain merchants or simply the inevitability of seasonal return. Did people seek out the same trader year after year out of trust, or because the fair itself acted as a magnet pulling the same circles together? The evidence is scattered like the fair's torches, bright in some places, fading in others. The sensory detail envelopes you. You smell roasted lamb dripping fat onto coals, the sweetness of honey cakes sold from wooden trays, the tang of ale spilling from horns. You hear pipes and drums weaving through the crowd, their music bouncing against the night air like sparks. The ground is soft underfoot, packed with trampled grass, warm from the bodies pressing together, and humor dances through the meadow. First joke. A merchant offers the best deal of the year, while another mutters, "You said that last year, too." Second joke. A wrestler trips over his own tunic before the match begins, earning cheers louder than for the actual winner. Third joke. A baker swears his honey cakes are blessed by gods, only for a wasp to land squarely on top. Divine approval, or just sugar addiction? Yet beneath the laughter, loyalty sings clearly. These fairs weren't just events, they were reunions. Returning to the same trader each year became a ritual, part of the rhythm of life. A merchant who remembered your name, your family, or even your favorite cloth color earned your trust more deeply than silver scales ever could. Loyalty here was festive, woven into music and feasts, renewed under the same stars season after season. Your vision softens as the torches blur into golden halos, music fading into a steady pulse like a heartbeat. The crowd's laughter stretches into a gentle murmur, less a fairground than a dreamscape of light and warmth. You sway with it, lulled by the cycle of return, knowing that just as the fair comes back each year, so too does the comfort of sleep waiting for you now. The meadow's laughter drifts behind you as you follow the toll of a bell carried faintly on the night air. Soon, you find yourself at the edge of a wooden church, small and rough, but glowing with lamplight through narrow slits. Inside, the atmosphere shifts from rowdy fairground to solemn ritual. Farmers kneel on straw-strewn floors while priests in simple robes chant prayers that echo off the beams. Point one mainstream historical fact. By the late Viking Age, Christianity was spreading through Scandinavia. Churches became not only centers of worship but also hubs of economic life, collecting tithes and keeping rudimentary records of offerings. In effect, loyalty to the church was tracked in souls and silver alike. The quirky twist comes in the way payments blurred with piety. Some congregants offered butter or livestock instead of coin, mirroring the old tribute traditions, but now directed toward a different power. A farmer might hand over a calf, another a sack of grain, while a fisherman promised a share of his catch. Picture it as a divine loyalty program. Give offerings faithfully and earn the promise of spiritual protection and maybe a smoother path to heaven. Historians still argue whether these early church records served more as economic ledgers or as symbolic gestures of devotion. Were priests acting as accountants, tallying up butter and hides, or were they primarily concerned with spiritual loyalty, letting the numbers drift into ritual meaning? The distinction is blurry, like candlelight on rough walls. You let the sensory details seep in. The air smells of beeswax candles, mingled with damp wool from the congregation's cloaks. The wooden beams creak faintly as people bow and rise. A hymn rolls low and steady, more chant than song, vibrating in your chest like a slow drum. The faint sweetness of burning incense lingers, almost disguising the earthiness of straw underfoot. And even here, humor peeks through. First joke. 1. Farmer offers a particularly stubborn goat as tithe, only for the goat to escape mid-service and leap onto the altar. Second joke. A sleepy parishioner nods off during the sermon, jerks awake, and loudly mutters "Amen" at the wrong time. Third joke. A child sneaks a lick of tithe butter when no one's looking, proving some loyalty points are sweeter than others. But beneath the laughter, loyalty hums with quiet intensity. The church wove economic obligation with spiritual reassurance. Returning each week, each season, wasn't just about maintaining favor with priests. It was about belonging to a system where loyalty carried eternal weight, measured not in silver fragments or tally sticks, but in the promise of salvation itself. Your eyes soften as you watch the flicker of candles blur into golden halos. The chants stretch long and low, settling into a lull that feels timeless. The goats bleat, the priest's monotone, the rustle of straw, all merge into a single soft hum, steady and endless. You feel yourself sink with it, carried into calm, as if even your dreams are being gently tithed to the night. You step out of the wooden church and wander toward the quieter edge of the settlement. Here, a few merchants sit hunched near lanterns, their brows furrowed, voices sharp. They're not haggling over prices anymore. They're arguing about memory. Who owes what, when it was promised, and whether last season's debts have been repaid. Point 1 Mainstream historical fact. Viking societies had laws governing debt and trade, but many agreements relied heavily on oral promises, tally sticks, or community witnesses. Disputes often erupted when memory clashed with record, and resolving them could involve local assemblies known as things, where freemen gathered to settle matters. The quirky detail lies in how casual some of these contracts appear. A notch on a mug, a rune scratched into wood, or even a handshake under torchlight might stand in for a formal agreement. Which works fine, until someone swears the notch meant 10 barrels of fish, while another insists it was only 5. Imagine today's credit card bill arriving scrawled on a napkin, and you'll understand the confusion. Historians still argue whether these informal systems functioned as true contracts or as social expectations backed more by reputation than enforceable law. Were debts genuinely binding, or did people pay mostly to avoid shame and retaliation? The debates echo like the merchants' voices here, circling, overlapping, never fully settled. The sensory weight of the scene pulls you in. The lanterns sputter in the breeze, casting jagged shadows across tense faces. The night smells of pine resin and damp earth, sharp with the tang of ale spilled earlier. Boots scuff against dirt as men shift impatiently, their words snapping like dry twigs. You feel the heat of their frustration, the sting of old promises dragged back into light. And humor, stubborn as ever, sneaks into the quarrel. First joke. One man waves his tally stick so wildly he accidentally smacks himself in the forehead. Contract enforcement by self-inflicted injury. Second joke. Another insists he paid last season in spirit, which is the Viking equivalent of saying exposure is currency. Third joke. A tired onlooker mutters, "At this rate, the goats will settle it for us," proving sarcasm is as old as barter. Still, beneath the humor, loyalty threads through even these disputes. The fact that arguments mattered, that debts were remembered, shouted over, and wrestled with, shows how much weight trust carried. A broken promise could fracture a network of return customers, while a fair settlement could restore loyalty. Stronger than before. These quarrels weren't signs of failure, but of how deeply loyalty was woven into Viking trade. Your vision softens as the merchants' voices blur together into a low drone, less argument than lullaby. The lantern flames stretch tall and waver, like sleepy eyes half closing. The shadows smear into long shapes rocking back and forth, no longer quarrelsome men, but restless figures drifting toward silence. And as you watch, the rhythm of their dispute slows, carrying you with it, as though even arguments in the Viking age can sing you gently toward sleep. You leave the quarrel behind and follow a narrow track lit by the faint glow of dawn. The horizon is streaked pale gray, and your feet carry you toward the thought of time itself. How these improvised systems of loyalty, these tokens and tally sticks, didn't vanish but morphed. You picture a quiet thread stretching from Viking riverbanks to modern counters, where shop clerks swipe plastic cards with practiced ease. One mainstream historical fact. Many scholars see continuity between early symbolic tokens of loyalty, tally sticks, marks on mugs, repeated gift exchanges, and later formalized systems like medieval guild records, merchant ledgers, and eventually the loyalty cards of the 19th and 20th centuries. A notch on a horn mug wasn't so different in spirit from a stamp on a paper card centuries later. The quirky side of this history shines in the details. In 18th century London, some coffee houses issued copper tokens stamped with their logos, exchangeable only at their shop. Sound familiar? It's basically the Viking principle of return trade, updated with fancier metal. Even 19th century American stores handed out paper punch cards, Buy so many pounds of flour, get a bonus, echoing the free pelt slipped into a fur bundle centuries earlier. Vikings would probably nod and say, yes, we invented that, too. Historians still argue whether it's fair to call Viking practices true loyalty programs. Were they consciously fostering repeat trade, or were they simply improvising ways to survive without steady coinage? The leap from bone-etched IOUs to magnetic stripe cards is vast, but the heartbeat is the same. Trust, repetition, recognition. The sensory drift carries you further. You imagine the cool weight of a tally stick in your hand, now morphing into the crisp snap of a cardboard punch card. The clink of hack silver becomes the electronic beep of a scanner. The familiar face of a first seller shifts into the practiced smile of a cashier who remembers your order. History folds neatly, layer upon layer, until past and present blur. And humor gleams even here. First joke. You picture a Viking proudly showing his bone IOU at a modern grocery checkout, only to have the cashier stare blankly. Second joke. A modern loyalty app glitches, and you mutter, at least tally sticks never needed Wi-Fi. Third joke. You imagine Odin himself trying to redeem points for a free cloak, only to be told he's one stamp short. Yet beneath the laughter, loyalty endures. Whether carved into bone or stored in digital clouds, the principle remains the same. Return to me, and I'll remember you. That memory, the recognition of face, the trust of name, is older than any card or app. It's carved into human need itself. Your vision softens as these images swirl. Punch cards blur into runes, glowing screens melt into torchlight, silver fragments dissolve into digital points. The sound of a scanner beep stretches into the soft creak of a ship's rope, then into nothing but silence. You sway with it, lulled by the thought that even the most modern rituals are ancient echoes, rocking you gently towards sleep. The faint glow of dawn spreads wider, soft gray turning into pale gold, and you find yourself walking through a village that is slowly waking. Chickens stir in coops, smoke rises from hearths, and the river glitters like a ribbon unfurling toward the horizon. It feels like the end of the journey, but also like a loop, where old stories ripple forward into the present. One mainstream historical fact: the sagas that carried Viking memories forward were themselves loyalty devices, preserving names, reputations, and deeds so that communities continued to honor the same families and traders across generations. Storytelling kept loyalty alive when all else, silver, furs, even wooden tally sticks, crumbled away. The quirky side you notice is how these sagas often exaggerated trades and gifts to mythical proportions. A man didn't just give butter, he gave enough butter to feed giants. A trader didn't just return each season, he sailed so reliably that even whales knew his schedule. Imagine bedtime stories as the Viking version of customer testimonials, part truth, part sales pitch, all loyalty. Historians still argue whether these sagas accurately reflect real trade practices or simply dress them up with drama. Were loyalty gestures as grand as the storytellers claimed, or were they simple human courtesies puffed up into legend? The line blurs, as it always does, between memory and marketing. The sensory world folds soft around you. The river air tastes fresh, carrying pine and damp earth. The morning birdsong rises and falls, soothing as a harp. Children chase each other between huts, their laughter light and untroubled. You smell bread baking in clay ovens, the warmth wrapping the village in promise. And humor lingers to the end. First joke. One storyteller brags his ancestor invented the first loyalty program, only for another to shout, "No, mine did," proving that plagiarism is eternal. Second joke. A raven caws loudly over the river, as though demanding loyalty points for its services as messenger. Third joke. You imagine a Viking farmer muttering, "Do I get a free cloak if I come back next year?" The echo of a question still asked in stores today. Beneath it all, loyalty is the thread tying centuries together. Whether it's a notch on a mug, a hidden bargain in a fur bundle, a carved runestone, or the barcode on your grocery receipt, the principle is the same. Return, repeat, remember. The Vikings may not have had plastic cards in their wallets, but they had loyalty written in trust, carved in ritual, and carried in stories that refused to fade. And so, with the river shining and the village alive, Your own journey comes to rest. You breathe slowly, the rhythm of history melting into the rhythm of sleep. The torches, the markets, the ships, the stones, all soften into a single warm blur. Loyalty, it turns out, is not just a tool of trade. It is a lullaby, ancient and ongoing, singing you back into the quiet. Now the story grows slower, softer, like the hush that follows a feast when only embers glow in the hearth. You don't need to imagine silver clinking or torches flaring anymore. Instead, let yourself rest in the quiet spaces between those memories, as though walking through an empty hall where every sound is cushioned in straw. Your breath evens out, rising and falling gently, steady as the tide. The voices of merchants, the laughter of taverns, the gossip by fires, all of it recedes into a distant murmur, no louder than the rustle of leaves at dusk. You are no longer in the marketplace, no longer in the swirl of oaths or barter. You are drifting through silence, where even history bows to the rhythm of sleep. Picture the fjord at night, utterly still, its waters dark and smooth as polished stone. A single longship rocks gently at anchor, its sail furled, its shield stacked neatly along the rail. No crew stirs, even the gulls are quiet. The only sound is the soft lap of water against the hull, steady, repetitive, like the faintest heartbeat. This is the rhythm you lean into, a reminder that the world holds you calmly, securely. The air around you is cool, but not biting, just enough to refresh. Imagine wrapping yourself in a wool cloak, heavy but comforting, the kind that smells faintly of pine smoke and warmth. Above, the stars glow in scattered clusters, timeless and distant, each one a reminder that countless others have looked up at them before. Vikings, farmers, traders, storytellers, all staring into the same night sky, all lulled by its slow, steady light. Let your thoughts grow longer, stretched out like the horizon at dawn. Each breath is a wave washing over you, smoothing the edges of wakefulness. Each exhale carries away the weight of the day, leaving you lighter, calmer. There is no need to follow every thought, no need to keep tally. Like silver hacked into pieces, the details scatter harmlessly. What remains is only stillness, only rest. Imagine lying now on soft grass at the meadow's edge. The fair is over, the fire's extinguished, the stalls taken down. What lingers is only the scent of trampled clover and the faint warmth of the earth beneath you. Above, the night folds into early morning, and you feel the quiet embrace of a world that asks nothing from you, except to close your eyes. So let yourself drift. The markets will wait, the ships will return, the stories will keep whispering without you. Loyalty is not only about returning to a place or a person, it is about returning to yourself, to the safe harbor of your own stillness. Tonight, you've traveled far enough. Now the journey is inward, slow and effortless, towards sleep itself. And as you sink, let the last echoes soften into nothing but breath. In, out, steady calm. History has done its work. The story is complete. You are safe. You are home. You are asleep.